Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining us for yet another Logiwa Quick Take, a small investment, 15 or 20 minutes of your time with hopefully a big payoff for you. Our intent here is to have everybody leave with more information than they had in their pockets when they joined us. So again, thanks for taking some time this morning, this afternoon, or your lunch hour, whenever you're listening to us for this week's quick take topic, which, Jamie, if you'll advance, the slide is your WMS software on premise versus the cloud. An ongoing discussion, which has been ongoing now for 15, maybe almost 20 years, but is still one that comes up very often when we're dealing with our clients who are implementing WMS software at their warehouses. So without any further ado, I am very pleased to have my partner in crime, Dr. Jamie Babka. I just am encapsulating all of your certifications into that one doctor title, sir, if I may. Thank you again, Jamie, for joining us. Why don't you take it away from here?
Sounds great. Thanks, Wayne. And thanks again, as always, for the gracious introduction. So as Wayne mentioned earlier, today we're going to be talking about on-premise versus cloud and some of the factors you should think about for evaluating providers between the two. So before we jump into the meat of the presentation, I want to start with a just basic definition of what we're calling on-prem versus cloud in the perspective of this presentation, at least. There's a lot of nuance when it comes to hosting. So just for the sake of simplicity, we're breaking it down into two categories. If a third party is managing the hardware that your application is hosted on, then that application is on cloud. If you are owning, installing, and managing that hardware that the application is on, then you are on-prem. Note that this classification even applies even if your hardware is licensed or rented from a cloud service provider. If you have to manage the environment, we're referring to that in this context here as on-prem because you are ultimately responsible. So that out of the way, let's take a look at some categories to consider when you're evaluating an on-prem versus on the cloud software solution. So there's a lot of considerations to make in this decision. So we're going to break this down into 3 different lifecycle phases and 3 different categories for each. So we're going to talk about the considerations during the setup, the go live, and post go live, or what we're referring to generally here as maintenance phases of a project. For each of these phases, we're going to talk about 3 different categories: hardware, software, and people, the members of your team. And hopefully by the end of the episode, you'll have a better grasp of what things to consider and what questions to ask when facing this type of decision, not only with a WMS, but really applicable to other software platforms as well. So without further ado, let's talk about setup. So setup is probably the most crucial life cycle stage to consider, as many decisions early on have long-term consequences and costs, particularly in regards to maintenance. It's usually also the focus area for most of the evaluation. A lot of folks are looking at what does it take for us to get started. So let's first talk about hardware considerations during the setup phase. So with an on-premise solution, you will have the benefit of controlling the hardware since you own or you're renting it. You can scale up and scale down the technology as needed, and you only need to stay within the hardware recommendations of the software platform provider in order to be successful. That includes your computers, your mobile devices, and the infrastructure, your databases, your servers, etc. This gives you the benefit of redundancy and business continuity measures based on what your needs and risk tolerances are. So for example, if you're okay with taking some risk in exchange for potentially lower costs, you could choose to, say, host your data in just one physical location. However, if you choose to skip that step, you are taking on that additional risk. But these are all decisions and controls that you have. If you decide to take an approach that's a little bit less risky, maybe like bidirectional replication or multiple data centers, you are facing additional costs, additional ongoing maintenance, etc. But either way, in that situation with on-prem, you are on your own. If you need to scale up or if you need to add redundancy, that's a project that you need to take on and you should be considering in your evaluation. Now with cloud solutions, you have the benefit of offloading the hardware setup and hardware decision-making to the provider since they own it and maintain it. Also, because virtually every on-cloud software provider is using a web application, your existing computers and mobile devices are already likely to be compatible with it, as they generally come standard with web browsers and are able to access the application. However, you're at their whim when it comes to a reliable and performant hardware infrastructure. If there's a reliability or performance issue, you'll need to work it out with the provider, and they can vary in responsiveness and willingness to address the issue. So reputation is really key. So in this area of hardware, in regards to the setup phase, there's a couple questions you should consider in your evaluation. Number one, what would happen should I lose access to all of my data on this platform? Is that a significant risk? In most warehousing operations, that is an extremely critical risk, and so typically has a very low risk threshold. Next question is, how critical is the performance and scalability to my operation? And do I have the right team of resources to support this application today, 6 months from now, and 2 years from now? Basically, if you are engaging in an on-prem solution, do you feel like your growth trajectory is going to eventually outscale your hardware? And are you going to need to anticipate having some hardware projects down the pipe? And then finally, do my computers, my mobile devices, my printers, my tech stack, do these all meet the specifications for the platform that I'm launching? With cloud providers, you're typically using like a browser-based application, typically a little bit more forgiving when it comes to device selection. With on-prem, if you have like native applications and things like that, then the hardware that you're using needs to be considered. So with that, let's transition over into software considerations in the setup phase. With on-prem solutions, this can vary by provider, but generally you'll have things like full control and access to configure the software provider directly. So oftentimes, with on-prem software, you may even have access to more of the guts of the application, so you can get under the hood, be able to tweak the code, access the database, etc. And so that can make configuring specific use cases sometimes a little simpler. You can kind of alter the way the application is intended to work. However, from that level of control, that usually comes with increased costs for setup, either via professional service to support that effort, or having to use your own staff for that setup. We'll talk more about the maintenance ramifications for this and later on, but that's also an item here to consider if you are, configuring something in a browser like an administrative UI versus if you need to actually modify the core of an application and you have to set up that configuration directly. With on-cloud solutions, oftentimes these require less effort from your side to get the application set up, but the limited access to that backend infrastructure, you're more reliant on the features of that platform to support your complex use cases. So for example, reporting. If the software that you're using doesn't offer a reporting module as a feature, or if there's a particular set of data that you're collecting that isn't made accessible through the platform, you may not be able to access that if you're using a cloud-hosted provider because you can't get access to the database. So that's another thing to consider with on-cloud solutions is, does the software meet all the feature needs that I'm going to need during the setup phase? A couple of questions to ask yourself when considering software during setup. Is this provider giving me a desktop application or is it a web application? And regardless of the side, can I run this with my current devices? How much control of the under the hood or the guts of the application do I really need? Does the software itself provide me with all of the use cases that I'm going to need it for? Or would I have a need to dig in under the hood? These are typically things like reporting, configuration control, etc. Last item here, let's talk about setup and how it relates to your team, your staff. With on-prem solutions, many on-prem providers are focused on providing guidance or setup as a service, and things like implementation, project management. These are services that you can engage them for. If you already have the resources for that, there's a potential cost savings should you not have a need for doing that. However, if you don't have that type of resource, or that resource is allocated elsewhere, then you'll need to rely on that provider, which could come with increased costs, especially considering that they'll likely need to come on site or have some kind of direct access to your infrastructure in order to help. With on-cloud solutions, oftentimes the provider includes setup as part of their agreement. Because the application is hosted on their infrastructure, they have full access, and they can usually provide lower cost configuration services as their team does not need to be on site for implementation. However, the level of implementation services can vary drastically depending on the providers. So if you have a particularly complex operation, a low level of attention can lead to confusion or a bad experience. So in this area, a couple questions to consider for yourself. Do I have the right people and bandwidth to take on an on-prem setup project? And how involved is this provider going to be with the setup process? And how in-depth will they go in understanding your operation? So these are just some items to consider when evaluating a cloud versus on-prem solution when it pertains to the setup phase and what that's going to look like for the first phase of your project. With the setup portion out of the way, let's go and talk about the go live phase. So go live is generally your make or break time for any software implementation project. And the go live process for on-prem versus cloud is slightly different. So let's talk about some of the categories here. So first off, starting with hardware during go live phase. With an on-prem solution, there are usually a few tests that need to be done before launching that are specific to your hardware, such as penetration security testing and load testing, et cetera. You could choose to skip these if your risk threshold is low enough, but it's generally advisable to perform these kinds of activities before you're going live with a new set of hardware. In addition to the tech stack testing, you'll also need to consider a network testing strategy to ensure your devices and tech stack can be properly and reliably communicative with each other. As this is your technology, on-prem providers either need to be on site to provide support or may not provide the service at all. So there's generally some additional setup steps when it comes to on-prem hardware for go live and testing. With on-cloud cloud solutions, there's usually isn't much to do regarding hardware testing before launch. Sometimes load tests are necessary, particularly if you're building integrations, et cetera, but generally you're looking at a lot less time commitment from the hardware front. However, if there is a hardware issue, you're at the whim of the cloud service provider. So selecting a reputable vendor will be critical in avoiding this risk. So a couple questions to ask yourselves here in this area. Am I confident that my tech stack and devices are ready to handle a real production level workload securely and efficiently if you're going with an on-prem solution? And two, does a software provider work with other organizations that have similar or higher demands as mine? It's a very important question of, does this provider have the infrastructure that can support the type of activities that I intend to use it for? Next, let's talk about go live from a software perspective. The software portion is fairly similar between on cloud and on-prem. It usually involves configuration testing, trial runs, dress rehearsals, those types of things, dry runs to make sure everything's ready to go. However, the key here is a motivation perspective. On-prem providers are generally more commercially motivated by initial setup fees and professional services fees. And because they can benefit from a prolonged setup and scope creep of the project, less reputable providers may be inclined to take advantage of this. Now, I doubt there's truly a lot of nefarious providers out there that are doing this, but it is worth considering the commercial model may unconsciously or subtly influence motivations in terms of support for go live. Especially in contrast with on cloud, they're more commercially focused on licensing fees, long-term relationships, healthy go lives, versus one-time setup fees. They're not commercially set up that way, and therefore can generally be more motivated to support a successful go live and to avoid scope creep and keep everything on the rails. So for this area, here's a couple questions to consider. How does the commercial model for the software provider potentially impact motivations to support a successful go live? And how much support does the provider give me with testing and trial runs versus what I'm looking for? These are typically pretty equal when it comes to the software perspective, but from a hardware perspective, it's either you're doing it or they're doing it just as part of their general service offering. So finally, let's talk about go live and how it relates to your team. With on-prem solutions, generally they're providing guidance and services for implementation project management, and they typically stay on that project through go live. So you have that support all the way from setup to go live. However, it is a limited engagement. There's usually a transition of responsibility from this implementation project management stakeholder to a member of your organization. And generally during that hectic go live schedule, that transfer of information can be a little bit challenging if not properly planned for. With on-cloud solutions, again, being generally focused on long-term relationships and partnership, you usually have a dedicated account manager or customer success manager or an implementation team member that's familiar with your operation that is made available to you for the long term that you'll have access to. This is particularly of interest to cloud service providers because, again, they're trying to maintain that long relationship. I know here at Logua, we do the same. And so that is a thing to consider. So for this area, a couple questions to consider. Do I have the right team members in place with the proper bandwidth to coordinate a successful launch? A lot of people have a misstep here of how much time you have available to commit to a project like this versus bringing in a dedicated outside resource. And finally, will I have access to the materials and collateral that I need to train and prepare my team for the launch? So let's go ahead and move on to our last phase of the project regarding ongoing maintenance. Oh, there's a Mickey Mouse in here. I forgot about that. So let's talk about on-premise versus cloud in regards to maintenance. And let's start with hardware. With on-prem solutions, based on the decisions that you've made during setup, you may or may not be prepared for things like catastrophic events and data breaches, data loss events, etc. So having a process or a tool for monitoring your hardware and an additional consideration for ongoing support is going to be pretty critical. Business continuity is a pretty expansive area to try and consider for, and so that all just has to depend on your risk tolerance and what your IT strategy is. Also, as your operation grows, your tech stack may require scaling up or acquiring new technology, which would require your technical resources to support. So you need to plan ahead for such a project. If you're anticipating that in 12 months' time, your volume is going to double or you're going to bring on a new location, you'll need to prepare for essentially a launch to that new location. Or with on-cloud solutions, because they're providing the monitoring and the performance and security for the infrastructure, this can be one less item that's on your plate, one less project for your technical staff to have to monitor. However, again, the reputation here is key. If you're putting this responsibility into the hands of a provider, you need to rely on that provider to mitigate it. And so working with a reputable company is extremely important, and understanding their commitments to SLAs is critically important. So for this area, there are a couple questions to consider. Do I have the right resources and tools in place to adequately monitor for performance and security issues on an ongoing basis, should I choose to host an application myself? And I'm forecasting substantial growth over the next 6 to 24 months that could necessitate the need for hardware upgrade projects. And then again, similar to the question we had asked before, is does this software provider work with other organizations that have similar or higher demands, or work with organizations that have similar higher growth trajectories? Are they used to the model of somebody outgrowing their original implementation and requiring ongoing support and updates to hardware? So now let's talk about maintenance from a software perspective. This is usually a pretty big hitting area to consider. So with on-prem solutions, again, that benefit of having access to the guts of the platform for debugging of issues, you generally have more access to get under the hood and diagnose a problem should it come up. However, this benefit is assuming you have a dedicated resource for this and that this resource is readily available should you need it. Some on-prem providers can offer support, but again, it's commercially motivated. It's generally like an add-on service to have some kind of a retainer of support. So that is a consideration to make, and whether or not that's something that they offer by default. With on-cloud solutions, cloud solution agreements usually come standard with SLA commitments regarding ongoing support. usually again motivated to maintain that good relationship with their customers. However, that lack of visibility under the hood can be frustrating if you're trying to diagnose a deeply rooted issue because of that lack of under the hood access. So ensuring that provider has a strong support offering and a point of contact is critical to help mitigate this. Someone that you could, quickly get in touch with should there be a problem. So 2 questions to ask yourself here. Am I comfortable with owning my own availability and support for the platform? Do I have the resources and tools and people to do that? And do the SLAs and the support model meet the needs of my team? And remember, with ongoing overhead and people changing, there's those needs change drastically over time. And so with that, let's segue into the last topic about maintenance and how it relates to your team. Now, with on-prem solutions, there's a lot of variability in terms of maintenance support post-go live. Some organizations may simply hand you the keys and you'll need to be re-engaged with them should you need support from them. Others may offer more of an ongoing support retainer model. These can all really vary. But a cost-benefit analysis for ongoing support is highly recommended based on what your needs are. If you don't think that you're going to need ongoing support and that your team can handle it, you've got adequate training, you've got good documentation, maybe this isn't something that you need and might be a cost savings. But if it is, it's important to look into like what that ongoing support model looks like. Is it T&M or is it a monthly subscription, et cetera? With on-cloud solutions, because the commercial motivation, again, to maintain the business, there's generally some type of regular contact or touch with customers. This works to your benefit. They remain familiar with your operation and what you're doing. They can help you provide you with consultation, training, guidance, et cetera, as your operation continues to scale. So for this area, there's a couple of questions to ask yourself. Do I need to have a dedicated staff member for ongoing support, or do I need support at all from the provider? And 2, if I'm onboarding new hires, do I have the right resources to provide the training and support to allow them to be successful, or does the provider have an option for me to engage with them for support? So a lot of questions and things to consider while making an evaluation in these 3 different phases. So just take a minute here on our last slide to distill this down into a couple areas and we'll wrap things up. So if you're considering on-prem, number 1, you own the setup. Professional services is generally a significant upsell from on-prem vendors. And so while there could be some cost savings if you have the proper resources to do it, this is a pretty significant consideration to make up front and on an ongoing maintenance basis for maintenance. SaaS vendors continually must re-earn your business and are commercially motivated to ensure smooth experiences. This is a thing to take advantage of. They're looking for a long-term healthy relationship, working partnership-wise with customers. And so that can be a pro in that column. And then finally, considering your staff and if they have the bandwidth and skills to set up, launch, and support your platform, or if you feel like you're going to need outside help to be factored in, considering what other projects you'd like your technical team to be working on, if you don't want them to be spending their time maintaining, the hardware and infrastructure for your software platform or helping people with I forgot my password and things like that. If you don't have that type of support available inside of your organization, then that could be a consideration for a cloud service provider. So that wraps up the presentation for today. Wayne, do you want to take us out?
I certainly will. Can't possibly follow that act. Jamie, thank you so much. That was a ton of information in this short period of time. Ladies and gentlemen, we, as always, will make the recording available to anyone who would like. Please feel free to use the chat function here in the webinar to let us know if you'd like any specific follow-up information. Jamie or myself would be very happy to get back to you. Just let us know. We'll leave the meeting open for a minute while we do that. Also, if anybody here is interested in how Logiwa deploys cloud-based WMS software and what that means, and maybe speak a little bit to us about cloud versus on-prem software, let us know. You can go to logiwa.com, request a demo, and we'll put you in touch with one of our product experts. So With that, folks, again, get your last minute chats and requests in. We appreciate you joining us every other Friday for 15 or sometimes maybe 20 or 25 minutes, depending on the topic. Investment in your time, hopefully take away 1 or 2 or 3 good pieces of information that'll affect your business, your operations, your life. With that, everyone, have a great, safe, happy weekend. Jamie, as always, thank you. Take care, everyone.